Now you were a teenager and you had some camera gear in the 70s.
Well, my father was an art dealer. He had a gallery on La Cienega, Felix Landau. So this is our neighborhood, West Hollywood.
Okay.
And so I grew up around a lot of art. I had very quickly understood and appreciated visual art. And around the age 16, I got my first camera. I got into photography. And at that point, we were living up just right above Tower Records on Shoreham, just off of Horn. So as I was starting to explore the world, to me, the world was Sunset Strip, because I'd walk out, a block and I'd be on the strip.
Yeah, and in the music industry, I mean, just to clarify everything, after the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, I guess the music business was less of a moneymaker until Monterey Pop and eventually Woodstock happened, and all the rock groups were generating kind of money in the 70s that had not been seen in before or since, really. Technically, as far as sales, it was a really healthy period. So they were advertising rock and roll on the billboards. As a matter of fact, there's a quote John Lennon made in 1975 or something to the BBC in an interview where he says, "Rock and roll, Hollywood is a rock and roll town now." It became sort of almost equal with the movies as far as its presence.
That's right. Yeah, it really became a business then. Until people were making money, but not the artists specifically. And what happened? The artists who sort of came of age in the '60s got smarter. And there are a lot of independent businessmen taking over the sort of the old style big company record industry was changing. And people like Lou Adler, Herb Alpert, these were guys who had experience not only producing music, but some of them singing, and they got involved in all aspects of the business, and they turned it more into a personal business. And that's when you started seeing the really interesting album covers come along, which were the genesis of these great billboards. That's where the art began.
And so I used to think about a guy like James at 15 or something in the 1970s. You were a young guy and you were just said, "I'm going out and you're photographing." Where did it come from?
Well, as I said, my first camera was a Nikkormat, which was an early version of a kind of a cheap Nikon camera, and I was out sort of exploring the world, and Sunset Strip was a world, and you couldn't help but notice these amazing billboards that were lining the street.
Yeah.
And if you lived there, you'd see them on a daily basis, and you soon realize that every 30 days or so they would change.
Yeah.
And you're also aware of the fact that they weren't printed or photographs, there were guys painting them. They were all hand painted then, there was no digital. So I'd see the guys out there on the scaffolds touching them up, painting them, and then taking them down. So I soon realized that after 30 days these things were gone, they were history. And to show them even to my friends who lived in LA but didn't frequent the strips, I started documenting them.
Yeah, and at the time, in 1970, Tower Records opened up on the Strip, and there hadn't been a record store quite like that. I mean, they went out and bought all the dead stock catalog, I recall, and you would just find, I guess, anywhere in the world in those days. Phil Spector's Christmas album, for example, was in those days, a $75 to $100 album, and my friend found 5 of them in Tower's bins because it was just they were buying all this old stock and whatever was new, and the industry was pressing tons of stuff then. So Tower sort of being in the center of the Sunset Strip. I mean, the first time I started going to the Strip a lot as a kid was with my friend, and we were going to Tower Records. The destination, that was the main destination, and just to see the massive amount of catalog.
They were open late at night, and if you had nothing else to do, you could go spend hours there looking at the records. And you were blocks from the Continental Hyatt House and a couple blocks the other way to the Whiskey and the other clubs. So a lot of the rock acts were staying up there. I think Led Zeppelin pretty much lived at that Continental Hyatt House. So it wasn't that uncommon to see some of those people late at night in the record store.
Yeah, and there's footage of Elton John, I believe, in 1975, promoting his album Captain Fantastic, I believe. And so here's this really, important record store, and you're driving down Sunset Boulevard, and it was almost like the whole record industry is putting ads on your way to get to the record store to see these things.
Yeah, Tower Records itself looked like a giant billboard gone amok. It was covered with signage everywhere, every inch of Tower Records. They had huge painted smaller versions of the album covers. And if there was a budget for it in the band, they'd put inflatables up. The Rolling Stones, for the Steel Wheels tour, had 5 inflatable figures sitting on the roof. So it was sort of geographically the center of the Strip, and so it was surrounded by all these billboards, and it was in a way a billboard itself. Otherwise, it was a pretty nondescript horizontal building that's still there.
This is a book that I thought would never happen because well, now you've researched the Foster and Cleaser archives and things like that, but some people had researched and couldn't really find a whole lot of this material. But he was there with his camera capturing it all.
Yeah, and well, not only that, I did, once I had the idea to do this visual book, I took it to the publisher and she said, where's the text? So I really had to think about, writing something that made sense with that. And to me, the idea was to go back and try to find the people who were responsible for this great artwork that's depicted here.
Yeah.
And I was just thrilled to learn that not only were a lot of these guys around and alive and doing well, still working, people like Gary Burden and Roland Young of A&M, all the great art directors of the period, but they were really happy to talk about that because they felt like me that it was a period that was, came and went and it's been sort of overlooked and lost to history. And so I think here's a chance in this book now to really examine this art. It really was a high art in a way because they weren't necessarily trying to sell you anything. Some of it was ego-driven. But it was this great art that had been created for the album covers, then translated to Billboards. And quite often there'd be no text at all. It would just be this, like for Pink Floyd, they had a pig, a dog, and a sheep. And if you didn't know that they had an album called Animals out, you didn't know what it was. They didn't care. They were talking to a very targeted audience, maybe to themselves, to other people in the industry, because all the record companies were up there on the strip. So it was a pretty unique time. It started. I'll just wrap that up. It started in '67. The Doors are credited with the first rock and roll billboard. It was actually Jack Holtzman's idea, and thanks to a friend of mine, Philippe, who's here, I got the opportunity to speak to Jack, and he was very proud to be known as the guy who got that whole thing going with the billboards. And in the book, there's even a picture of the Doors posing in front of their billboard. And then the whole scene lasted till like the early '80s when MTV came along. And then all the money that was being targeted for promotion on billboards went into making videos.
Yeah, now, about, I think, maybe 4 or 5, 6 pages in the first part of the book, it's very interesting because the Doors are seen standing around while they are painting the billboard on the floor, wherever it was that they were painting those billboards.
The Foster and Cleaser Studios.
At the Foster and Cleaser Studios, where was that?
That was like Western and, Washington near Vermont.
Washington near Vermont.
Mid-city LA.
Mid-city. And so here's the Doors standing around, and then they show them elevating it up and putting it up. I mean, the whole process is captured in your book with photography that had been done by.
Well, Foster and Cleaser had a photographer, but also the art director of Elektra Records was there with a camera and took some pictures.
Bobby Klein.
Yeah, well, no, he was there too. So
there's a lot of people doing photography on this particular.
Yeah, we had to track them all down.
All right, and then later on that year, the band Love had a billboard for Forever Changes, also Elektra, and Tim Buckley.
Yeah, well, Jack told us that. First of all, he said that I asked him, were the Doors happy to be part of this publicity? It was kind of an anti-commercial bent at the time.
Yeah.
But he said they were actually really thrilled, and he said the idea of Jim hanging over the strip like a scepter just thrilled him. He was actually pleased with that. So they were happy participants, and they posed for pictures. You see them there in this busy billboard studio. Nobody's paying any attention to them. Nobody really knew who they were at the time.